So we invited Delia to come and talk to us about her take on cybernetics, her take on her understanding. So we got a sort of different bit of insight. Delia, as I'm sure you've read, is president of the ISSS, so she had a busy weekend last weekend, a council member of the American Society of Cybernetics and doctoral student at Hull, working with the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University. And I read that and thought, wouldn't it be great if we had a School of Cybernetics at an English university, whether or not it was. So maybe there's something for us to work on as part of the ambition. Delia, I'm imagining you would like to share some slides.
No, I have no slides, because okay. I'd like this to be a conversation, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine. It's your session, so I shall at this point say, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Delia Pembry, get stuck in. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, John, for the invitation, and thank you everyone for having me here this morning. So it's my night time here in Australia. Just a few little mini corrections there. Not a doctor yet. I hope to be here by the end of the year. So please wish me luck. Another thing is that we had, quite rightly, the internet. We had the conference last weekend for the International Society for the System Sciences. The theme for that conference was the art and science of the possible, of the impossible, the human experience. And we were very lucky to have the British Society for Cybernetics, the American Society for Cybernetics, run 3 tracks at the conference. And can I say, I was really, really grateful for the cybernetic input into the system science streams. It completely opened up the conversation. It really invigorated the community, and it really enlightened what normally is a very reductionist perspective. So you do have value, absolutely. One of the reasons why I don't particularly want to put on any slides at the moment, my first degree was a Bachelor of Information Systems. I was in the Royal Australian Navy at the time, so I'm a veteran, and that was where I got my first taste of information systems and systems thinking, but not cybernetics. I then went into learning theory, and I was a training technologist. So as you can appreciate, that in the Defence Force, we have to train people up very, very quickly and very, very efficiently. What I didn't realise at the time is that they actually use cybernetic principles. So they were using the triple loop learning to train the trainers to then train the staff. So that was an interesting, insight when I actually started my my PhD. As John mentioned, and as we're all experiencing, the pandemic is continuing. We are not over it, and it looks like we're not going to be over it. Here in Australia, we're now having another wave, and the field that I'm in is in the artificial intelligence arena for the public services. Now, one of the things that the pandemic is actually providing us is an opportunity to adopt artificial intelligence, but there's also a massive danger as well. And this is something that I feel that this is where cyberneticians can really start to grab hold of and engage, not just with organisations, but also with governments as well. At the conference, there were a couple of tracks on the opening up of critical cybernetics. There was some healthy debate as to whether we should actually separate or create a new component of cybernetics called critical cybernetics. I can understand that argument. However, I come from the field of critical systems thinking. And one of the things, things that I learned that was absolutely important in terms of critical systems thinking is the purpose of critical systems thinking. And that was to inquire into boundaries, inquire into systems, and find out what is making them right, what is wrong. Are these systems or are these decisions marginalizing people, excluding them?
Delia?
Yes.
You said you wanted conversation.
Yes. So I will come to, yes, sorry.
Is that how you develop your training data set for your AI?
Sorry?
Is that how you develop your training data set for your AI?
In terms of?
Identifying the purpose, the boundaries, the systems, the cognitive biases.
Yes. So we are moving into that area of having, the thing is that we tend to observe the cognitive biases, once we've done the models.
Right.
One of the things that that's more of a hypothesis rather than an actuality is, are we as individuals who are creating the models, are we also able to go back and trace back our own biases to see where they come from? So that's one of, and when I've presented some of my work, they said, well, that would take too long for us to trace back our own biases, to actually find out the foundations of where those our own internal biases are coming from. But I disagree with that. So yes, you're right. Often that the purpose of a model is normally to get an end outcome, but as I said, those biases only really emerge once you see the model, once the data comes through and the model is put into play, and then you see the outcome. What would be good from a cybernetician's perspective is, can we do that beforehand? Can we actually trace our own biases before we actually plug them into the algorithms ourselves? And it's just a question. So, and that's where I feel that we have options there. So that's essentially, so that's what I wanted to, sort of like open the floor to discuss, is sort of, this idea of, critical cybernetics as well, and ask the questions, because I do feel that it, is that it is almost like a subset, but it puts the ethical dimension into the cybernetic arena as a focus, and it also it also gives that purpose as well, rather than keeping it quite conceptual. So the other thing as well is, I also feel that within the British Society of Cybernetics, is, please connect with the systems communities as well. We can actually benefit with those synergies. I think the synergies are really, really important at this moment in time, especially when, cybernetics, especially, the conceptual components of cybernetics can really help frame problems and offer a transdisciplinary language that crosses boundaries across disciplines and across organizational functions. So that's me, and I just thought I would say thank you again for welcoming me to this AGM, And I hope that we have more synergies with you in the future.
Thank you.
Oops, you're on mute, John.
I suspect there might be one or two questions out there. I did start by saying thank you, Delia, for that, and then remember to turn the microphone on afterwards, as getting a bit dim this morning. So, so Mike, I think you were asking a question in the first instance. Do we have anything to add to your question?
Well, I'm very interested in this notion of the biography of bias, because depending on the training data set, and particularly if you form a concept of cybernetics as a set of interconnecting feedback loops, AI tends to be narrow in its definition, and the training data set seems to be very rich with cognitive bias, so that most AI applications in the real world have the character of mechanical Turks. Namely, you've got people fiddling away in the background to make sure it works properly and seamlessly and smoothly. So I'm very, very interested in how we evolve a cybernetic approach to the interoperability of the different AI algorithms that are out there. And I wondered, Delia, if you'd got anything to say on that.
I do. I have a lot to say on this. I have a lot to say. Okay, so the take that I've the rabbit hole, actually it has been a rabbit hole. I'm going to like acknowledge and I'll own it. I've gone down the rabbit hole of the human experience of cybernetics. So instead of just looking at it as a, as an observer, first observer, second observing thoughts, then wait a minute, if I'm inside myself, how am I actually experiencing, and how are the various inputs, the data inputs that are coming into my body through my 5 senses and other senses, because we're looking at, epigenetics and things like this as well.
Evolution.
Exactly. So what are all of those factors tapping in to my observing ability? Does that make sense? And so I went, so that's why I it was so important for me when I said, the art and science of the impossible, the human experience, is because I feel that this is an untapped space of cybernetics, of really going down that route that Maturana and Varela sort of started when they were talking about embodied cognition, and really starting to go, well, okay, what's the cybernetics of the human being, of the internal, what's the cybernetics of experience, basically. Now, once we start doing that, we start to understand that, sometimes the objective that we're being given to do, let's just say, we're trying to find the best person to do a particular job, but then we use that past data. That past data is going to start doing a reinforcing loop.
Yes.
Right, and then that's when it actually got described by a professor here as a washing machine. So all of a sudden it washes out and highlights what our actual biases are. But what do we do once we've seen them? Do we just correct the algorithm? Because if we keep doing that, it's not going to change this. And so you're just going to keep on perpetuating that same result. And that's the hypothesis anyway. I will say.
Yeah, Miguel has popped his hand up. Where are you, Miguel? There's someone on my screen. Should we go to Miguel?
Yes. Hi, Miguel.
Hey, I'm fascinated by this discussion. I've got a startup, and we're going to be using NLP for our purposes.
Yes.
I'm slowly getting my feet wet in this world, so I keep coming across the issue of bias. And it seems to me that one of the things that's happening is there's a lot of discussion about bias, but there doesn't seem to be anything like a clearinghouse of the types of bias, right? So that eventually the science of machine learning can come up with a checklist and say, okay, let's check our training data and verify against these potential sources of bias and see if it's okay to feed it through to create a new model. Is that the case, or is anybody taking that up?
If I can comment, I'd like to. Once we've seen a bias, how do we deal with it? It might interest you to know that I worked with John Grinder on NLP when I trained as a practitioner years ago, right in the early days when we used to have Turkish coffee in London together. And one of the things that I've concluded from the work I did with Chris Agiris of Harvard is that cognitive biases are actually the attack dogs of a belief system that is largely carried in the subconscious. The difficulty with that is that any sort of lived experience of the human being is activated by a trigger from the environment, which activates memory, cognitive, emotional, physical, behavioral memory. And when you carry that into the expression of relationships between people, then what we've had to form is a concept called culture cycle. Culture cycle is a kind of repeating pattern, which if it persists, allows you to take a non-linear predictive model into a cybernetic environment and say, if this continues to happen, what would we predict is the outcome likely to be? Now, as soon as you get into that, you can figure out where the mismatches are through the way in which the human beings operate. But I was much interested in the conversation with Raoul and Peter Cochrane the other day, technocrat versus humanist, whereas the technocrats try to damp out the human being by atomizing the work and then automating that. But if we start to look at biases, the biography of them is very, very difficult to get at. And certainly with the work that Harvard and other people on, and the work that's currently being done on perception, indicates that it is extremely difficult to get at the biography of it. But you can find the expression of it in the relationships. So I don't know if you're on the line, Tom, but if you're into conversation theory and researching it, you can change the way in which we operate feedback loops, interconnected feedback loops, one at a time, through conversations that alter the pattern of relationships that then find an emergent property in the cybernetic interactions across multiple systems. And that's what's always interested me. My work has largely been on international supply chains, multiple jurisdictions, multiple cultures, multiple differences, and how to leverage those in favor of a better life for the individual human being.
Thanks, Mike. If I can come in, I think I've got two Bens with their hands up. I'm not sure who was first. I'll go with Ben Taylor first, and then you, Ben Sweeting, afterwards.
Oh, well, we might be agitating on the same point, I suspect, because I've been triggered by Ben. I can't, I'm uncomfortable with the conversation on bias continuing without saying what the hell is a bias and what are we comparing it against? I would introduce here a good old-fashioned Elliot Jack's definition of work, the discretion of the exercise of discretion within boundaries towards a purpose over time. And if we had more of a framing like that, which I think is a good cybernetic framing, we would start to have to define our terms, because we're acting as though there's a computable, rational world out there which we can know, and that begs quite a few questions. So I'm sorry to not ask a question, John, but
no, that's absolutely the point. We're having a conversation, Ben. That is entirely the point. Dr. Sweeting.
Yeah, I was actually going to say something different, but I'll just add on to that from Benjamin. So yeah, I think that's like a potential difference between maybe what cybernetics can contribute, potentially, as Delia is saying, compared to the way this is currently discussed in AI, at least in my experience of it, where the discussion is about eliminating the bias from the way the data sets are constructed, which just seems a kind of pretty unreflective kind of attitude to it, where oh, okay, we've mediated the data, we've removed this, we've got this variety, whereas actually I think the conversation is much more far-reaching about what we're doing and what that means. Maybe I can just transition from that, Delia, to a bit of a question, which is You mentioned critical systems thinking, which is this kind of framework which kind of orders a series of methodologies, which essentially Mike Jackson has put kind of a life into making sense of. And I think systems thinking really benefits from that effort, because and I've heard him speak recently on it, and it's kind of really meaningfully constructed. And kind of within that, there is, one of the items is a cybernetic one, is VSM, and another one is critical systems heuristics, which kind of feels to me, and maybe to Tom Scholter, and I think to you, like it really has an affinity with cybernetics, and that it could do with a presence within the cybernetic discussion. So just wonder if you could comment on that, and maybe on the value of having this kind of framework which systems thinking has, but cybernetics quite explicitly doesn't.
Okay, right. Goodness, there's a lot of things in that one.
Sorry.
So we're going to go first bias, critical systems thinking, Mike Jackson, the heuristics, and the VSM. Sorry. And can I just clarify that that's the viable systems methodology that you're talking about by Stafford Beer? Yep. Okay. Excellent. Right. So I just want to just answer to the bias, and I'm doing the air quotes bias. Yeah, Benjamin Taylor. Yeah, I do. Yes, I do feel that it does need to be identified, because bias as well is also a knowledge set. When you have an expertise, that's why sometimes you can get into your echo chamber and you're very knowledgeable and expert in that, and that's your bias. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. So it just means that it only becomes wrong when it disadvantages other people, or it disadvantages a group of people. That's when a bias goes horribly wrong, or becomes called, or that's what I've noted anyway. In terms of the critical systems thinking, so yes, critical systems thinking actually started off with Churchman, Charles West Churchman, and he was basically saying, see through the eyes of the other. Now, of course, that's where I saw my link with cybernetics, was seeing through the eyes of the other. And then we had Ulrich, Werner Ulrich, who basically came up with critical systems heuristics. And he was, and so you ask a series of questions to see who's in and who's out, who's being included, who's being excluded. And we start to reveal, the system boundaries. And that's where, for me, my supervisor is Gerald Midgley. And in his book, Systemic Intervention, there was one phrase that goes, that said, perhaps the boundary is key. And it was that I started to investigate the boundaries. And so my work is actually about the ontology of boundary, like how do boundaries come to life? Like how do they come into being? And Mike Jackson's work, one of his piece of work that I quite enjoy is he's got the framework called the System of Systems Methodologies, where he looks at simple and complex all the way, and then has looks at hard systems, soft systems, and then the coercive systems or the chaotic systems, which you'd see in David Snowden's work. The VSM in Mike Jackson's work, unless it's changed or has been updated, but previously it was actually situated in the soft systems space and in the complex, where you basically, where you could see systems, you sort of write your inputs out, and you could actually categorize all the different systems and the information moving between them. For myself, though, I focus on the human being, and because this is the only system that I know, and it's the only cybernetic system that I can actively and accurately test and experiment with and observe and trial with. So why I think that, why I feel that cybernetics is that this group here has a lot to offer is that we can start to move ourselves in from that observing position, or maybe doing a I don't know, maybe go quantum, like quantum cybernetics, where we're sort of like experiencing and observing at the same time. But we're able to observe all of it, and then hopefully put it on a table so that we can then discuss it. Now, going back to your point, Ben, I think it was Ben or Benjamin. We were talking about that's right. So the outputs of our models. You're quite right. What happens is that we actually start to tune the model. So we either tune the algorithm, or we clean the data, or we change the question. But the point that I want to make is, are we changing ourselves? Because we're the ones that created it in the first place. And what that algorithm is basically showing us is how our internal, is that subtle, there's that subtlety that we might not know about ourselves.
Thanks, Delia. I'm going to intrude, if I may, at this point, because I've got three hands up, and I'd like to hear from those three people. And then, so I think in the right order, they are Angus, followed by Margaret, followed by James Bryan. So Angus, you please.
Hello, Delia. Thank you very much for a fascinating and interesting talk yourself and having triggered it with others. I would first of all like you to tell us what name you would like to be recorded in the minutes, because the name we've had from John and the name that you're on your record isn't quite the same. So I'd like to get that right, but more to the point. This whole area of bias is truly important, I think, for all of us. And the question I would ask myself and everyone else is, as long as I am in the world of my own interior thinking, as long as I'm in ordinary consciousness of thought, and it doesn't matter whether I'm a relatively unschooled and trained or a highly trained intellectual critical thinker, as long as I'm in the world of my own internal ordinary observation of the thoughts that I have, I am basically swanning around, moving around between already produced thoughts from something or other, from some process, which you referred to, various others have referred to as some kind of prior activity that has taken place before these thoughts are there and capable of being observed. And when we enter into conversation, sometimes people bring us other thoughts. But the question that I would ask is, to what extent have we schooled ourselves in the ability to observe the activity that produces thoughts in the first place? It's only when we're actually capable of observing the activity that is normally entirely invisible, because it only becomes visible when it cascades into a languaged thought form, can we observe the actual inner activity of thinking, which is of a completely different nature from what it cascades into as the ordinary consciousness of thought within, ordinary consciousness of thought about feelings and everything else that we then discuss. And I'm wondering to what extent that schooling is required if we're going to really be successful in AI. I think it's not accidental that a lot of the cyberneticians have been interested in various forms of meditation, for example.
Gosh, I don't know how to answer that, apart from that I'm very excited that you said it and that you described it in such a way, this thought and the tumbling process, because Nora Bateson delivered a plenary where she launched a new word to describe maybe potentially something similar. And it was called aphanipoesis, which is basically that, where you don't actually know, that it's all those thoughts, but it's not really, you don't actually, it's that, it's that unseenness. So like you quite rightly said, Angus, is that you can't see it unless you have that stillness of thought. And the thing is, what she's saying is that it's not that it's not there, it's just that it's unseen. And anyway, it's a new word, it's a new concept. She's just presented a paper. She's got the paper on the ISSS website. And we're going to be setting up a working group, to sort of like explore that concept a little bit more. And it'd be great if you could come along as well, Angus, or anyone else who's on this on this meeting, because it's exciting. I think it's an exciting new development.
Thanks, Delia. That's really good. It even offers a good way forward. Margaret, please.
Hello, Margaret.
Margaret, unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry, still new at the Zoom thing. Yes, what concerned me a little about the way you were framing the problem space, if you like, was that you absolutely seem to be wedded with this idea of individuality or individual bias, as if you can actually dislocate it from the social stereotypes we live within. We basically, we exist in a sea of all of these things. It's very difficult to say whether this thought I have is actually my thought or one that actually I heard or experienced or was exposed to somewhere else. So how do you, when you're actually trying to disentangle the negative biases, if you say, from the just substrate of human experiences and cultures and belief systems and so on, in order to make a sort of perfect AI, I don't see how you can do that from an individualistic stance. You need to be looking at the collective and at the distributed nature of your cognitive content, and your sensorium, what that AI is actually their world, what they understand to be their world. And I say they very specifically because I can't see how an AI can, in a human sphere, in the sphere of humanity, let me put it that way, can actually come to an individual identity. And this notion of individualism has actually plagued us for hundreds of years in the West, if you like. And I think we have to re-examine our assumptions around it. So that.
Thanks, Margaret. You want to respond, Delia?
Yes. Thank you, Margaret. I completely agree with you. Unfortunately, the confines of language and for myself, I was trying to frame the conversation in a way that people could relate to, and most people can relate to themselves as an individual first, rather than others. Normally, in the space that I work in, and then I move out into the collective. But but you're absolutely right. Where I work, and actually I'm pretty certain, like we're talking about that, I haven't worked at Google or IBM, but one of the things that we're finding, is that all the data is, let me rewind. When I look at artificial intelligence, I see it as collective human intelligence. It's not just one person creating it. It's built on multiple systems, and it's hybrid of systems. And they're normally layered and contexted, and people are building upon building upon building. So there's a social component there. Then the data. The data is collected via interactions through a system of a sort. So again, we've got that collective coming through. and it's coming through the system that's being created by the collective, and then it's being punched out to a small team of people, or maybe even to another, another electronic system to then go out to people. So I agree, you're quite right, Margaret. It is a social thing, but the reason why I put it into a individual context is to make it practical. I'm a pragmatist, so I like something to be practical, and I found that when I try to go into the social and look at those relationships and say, look, you can't you can't. The two aren't separate; they are symbiotic, and they're connected. They're not even just connected; they're part of one another. So, but as soon as I start speaking like that, it seems to be too much for a lot of the people I speak to. They go, "Ooh, that's very conceptual." And it's like, okay, I'll have to bring it back in again. So thank you for bringing it up.
Thanks, Delia.
I hope I answered your question.
We need to push some boundaries quite hard at times. I'm going to take a final one from James Bryant. James, we've got 2 minutes, so a short question and Delia a short response, and then we'll be more or less back on schedule for the rest of the morning. James.
Okay, well, I was going to sort of add something into the debate, but so if one looks at through the way I'm looking at human behavior, humans basically are machines. But each of us has got different wiring. So we all are individual machines working in slightly different ways with overlap. AI is a set of rules and it runs a strategy, but the AI strategy only meets some of the requirements of the collective where basically interests overlap. So it's effectively, it's working as a normal distribution with some people included and other people excluded. And therefore, AI is itself a bias.
Thanks, James.
I suggest.
Okay, it's a really good contentious point to park the conversation on. I'll just throw into it, for those of you who like to read psychology, have a look at Strangers to Ourselves, Discovering the Adaptive Unconscious, written by Wilson about 2002, which really talks about that need for a deeper understanding of ourselves that we need to generate in order to bring anything like this forward. Delia, thank you very much. That was, I think, not what any of us were expecting to be doing this morning, including you, I think, from our earlier conversation, but absolutely fabulous. Can we please say thank you in the traditional manner? And then we can...
Thank you very much.